Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I am here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, the Unfinished Tales, The Silmarillion, The Children of Húrin, The History of Middle-earth, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin, The Fall of Numenor, whatever you got, or just anything about his works. And we're going to get to your questions today. We're going to do a reading first, and before that even, I'm going to tell you that if you have a question for me, you can send it to me any way you want, but if you want it featured in a video, the best way to do that is through Quora. So if you go down to the description, you'll see a link to my Quora account. You just click a little button that says Ask, and ask me any question that you want, and I will answer it as best I can. Of course, you could also leave me a comment, and I will answer you in the comments. So anyway, we have 16 questions to get to today, but first I want to read for you, and today we're going to read a little bit from Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth. And there's multiple stories in this, but I'm going to go with the first story here, which is of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin. So I'm going to read you a brief bit of this. Now Tuor came to the ruins of a lost road, and he passed amid green mounds and leaning stones, and so came as the day was waning to the old hall and its high and windy courts. No shadow of fear or evil lurked there, but an awe fell upon him, thinking of those that had dwelt there and had gone. None knew whither, the proud people, deathless but doomed, from far beyond the sea. And he turned and looked, as often their eyes had looked, out across the glitter of the unquiet waters, to the end of sight. Then he turned back again, and saw that the swans had alighted on the highest terrace, and stood before the west door of the hall. And they beat their wings, and it seemed to him that they beckoned him to enter. Then Tuor went up the wide stairs, now half hidden in thrift and campion, and he passed under the mighty lintel, and entered the shadow of the house of Turgon. And he came at last to a high-pillared hall. If great it had appeared from without, now vast and wonderful it seemed to Tuor from within, and for awe he wished not to awake the echoes in its emptiness. Nothing could he see near, save at the eastern end a high seat upon a dais, and softly as he might, he paced towards it, but the sound of his feet rang upon the paved floor as the steps of doom, and echoes ran before him along the pillared aisles. As he stood before the great chair in the gloom, and saw that it was hewn of a single stone, and written with strange signs, the sinking sun drew level with a high window under the westward gable, and a shaft of light smote the wall before him, and glittered, as if it were upon burnished metal. Then Tuor, marveling, saw that on the wall behind the throne there hung a shield and a great hauberk, and a helm of long sword in a sheath. The hauberk shone as if it were wrought of silver untarnished, and the sunbeam gilded it with sparks of gold. But the shield was of a shape strange to Tuor's eyes, for it was long and tapering, and its field was blue, in the midst of which was wrought an emblem of a white swan's wing. Then Tuor spoke, and his voice rang as a challenge in the roof. By this token I will take these arms unto myself, and upon myself whatsoever doom they bear. And he lifted down the shield, and found it light, and wieldy beyond his guess, for it was wrought it seemed of wood, but overlaid by the craft of elven smiths with plates of metal, strong, yet thin as foil, whereby it had been preserved from worn and weather. When Tuor arrayed himself in the hauberk, and set the helm upon his head, and he girt himself with the sword, black were the sheath and belt with clasps of silver. Thus armed he went forth from Turgon's hall, and stood upon the high terraces of Taras in the red light of the sun. None were there to see him as he gazed westward, gleaming in silver and gold, and he knew not in that hour he appeared as one of the mighty of the west, and fit to be the father of the kings of men beyond the sea, as it was indeed his doom to be. But in the taking of those arms a change came upon Tuor, son of Huor, and his heart grew great within him. And he stepped down from the doors, the swans did him reverence. And plucking each a great feather from their wings, they proffered them to him, laying their long necks upon the stone before his feet. And he took the 7 feathers, and laid them in the crest of his helm. And straightway the swans arose, and flew north in the sunset, and Tuor saw them no more. One of my favorite stories from the entire Legendarium is of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin. Really epic feel there. I highly recommend Unfinished Tales, if only for that story and the version of the Children of Húrin that's there, which is missing the middle section, but it does tell you to go to the Silmarillion and read specific pages and then to pick it up. Anyway, let's move on to your questions. And my glasses are dirty, so let's fix that. That way it makes it easier to read. That's an improvement. Okay, so this first question is from Drew Lavender, and Drew asks, why didn't Sting glow when they were surrounded by orcs in Moria? It did. I'm not sure where you got the idea that it didn't. It is mentioned that when they first arrived in Moria, there was no glow in Sting because they had just gotten to the east side where there were no orcs. We can see it in this quote from the Fellowship of the Ring. No gleam came from the blades of Sting or of Glamdring. I'm sorry. Do I have water here? I do not. No gleam came from the blades of Sting or of Glamdring. And that was some comfort, for being the work of elvish smiths in the elder days, these swords shone with a cold light if any orcs were near at hand. Moria is very big. It's a large place, and the great number of orcs that dwelled there at this time were mostly on the western side. However, later on, when the group is at Balin's tomb, we get this following quote. Another harsh horn call and shrill cries rang out. Feet were coming down the corridor. There was a ring and clatter as the company drew their swords. Glamdring shone with a pale light, and Sting glinted at the edges. Boromir set his shoulder against the western door. So, we don't really know what the effective range of Sting or Glamdring was, or of Orcrist in The Hobbit, but at the beginning of their journey through Moria, there weren't orcs, and when there were orcs, Sting did glow and Glamdring did glow. So I'm not sure where you got that idea. Okay. Next question. This is from Unseen Walker, who asks me, can we have some average age that an elf needs to start fading? Círdan, at 50,000 years old, showed no signs of fading. So, first off, we have to say that Círdan is likely not 50,000 years old. He's definitely not 50,000 years old. One may say that he actually does show signs of fading, depending on the interpretation. Círdan's age is in question due to the fact that his birth date is never really nailed down, but the earliest that it could possibly have been, if we assume that he was one of the original awakened elves, which he likely was, that would be in 1050 in the Years of the Trees. So the Years of the Trees was the counting system in the first age prior to the creation of the sun, and it was counted in Valiant years, which with each Valiant year was 9.5 solar years. So to measure Círdan's largest possible age, assuming that he's one of the original elves to awaken in Middle-earth, we can look at the final Year of the Trees, which was 1500. Now, it was after the destruction of the two trees, which was in 1498, but there was a period of darkness between the trees and the sun. So the last Year of the Trees was 1500, even though it was, 2 Valiant years, which if we think about that, that's 19 years after the trees were destroyed. But anyway, I digress. So we're going from 1050 to 1500, so 450 Valiant years, which is 4,275 solar years. So that's going from the earliest point that Círdan could have been born to the end of the Years of the Trees. So then there are 590 solar years till the end of the first age. So that would be 4,865, and then we add to that the second age, which is 3,441 solar years. So that would bring us to 8,306, and then there would be 3,021 years in the third age, which is when Círdan was at the Grey Havens when Frodo sailed west. So he would have been a grand total of 11,327 years old, solar years, when Frodo met him and Frodo sailed west. So that being said, That is the maximum age that he could have been at that time. The idea of fading can happen to elves who dwell too long in Middle-earth and they become houseless. They are then compelled to come to Mandos. Círdan appeared old. He had gray hair, he had wrinkles, and he had a long silver beard, which is something that no other elf had. Well, I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but elves generally do not have beards. Now, Tolkien originally had this idea that after many, many years, elves could enter a third cycle of life, and they would become old, in appearance at least, and they would even grow beards. Though Círdan is the only one that we see that's old like that and has a beard. So if Tolkien indeed abandoned his idea or not, that's up for debate. That's like a whole other kettle of fish. But if he had, it's possible that we could interpret Círdan's age, his advanced age, as the first signs of fading, because if Tolkien decided that there is no third cycle of life, that they just don't age further than they do when they become adults, then why is Círdan gray and old and wrinkled, and why does he have a beard? So we can say maybe this is what fading looks like in its early stages. Maybe it looks like elves growing old. You know, that's possible. And fading is the elven spirit, which we call the Fëa, overtaking the body, which is the Hroa. So it could be the body is getting weaker, the spirit is growing stronger, and we could say that a sign of the body growing weaker is shown in aging. This is a theory, of course. This isn't something that is necessarily true. Now, there is some indication that this is true. We're talking about another character, Maten. Maten had a beard, and he was not nearly as old as Círdan at the time that it was said that he had a beard. But so there's no explanation for his facial hair. He was a full-blooded Noldo elf. He lived in Aemon. He did not live in Middle-earth, and he was not incredibly old. The lack of elvish beards was so strong that men who were descended from elves, who had any amount of elvish ancestry, no matter how small it was, like Aragorn and Faramir, they couldn't grow beards. So the inclusion of Matan being a bearded elf, that's unusual, that's strange, and it doesn't fit with the idea that elves only grow beards after a long period of life, and possibly only if that is in Middle-earth due to the corruption of Melkor. So the reason that I say Círdan's age may be a sign of fading is because of the rapid aging of Gwyndor. So Gwyndor was captured by Morgoth, well, back then he was called Melkor, for 14 years. Actually, I think he was called both at that time. And when he finally escaped from Morgoth's palace, Angband, he didn't look the same, and he had grown old. And the elves that knew him didn't initially recognize him. This is in line with the idea that a great amount of physical or spiritual stress can have a very real and very permanent effect on the elvish Hroa. And the reason that I say this is because the most accepted origin of the orcs involves torture from Morgoth changing them. So if Morgoth's torture can both cause a loss of identity and also rapid aging, it's possible that rapid aging may be a sign of fading, with Gwyndor possibly resisting being turned into an orc, but was affected in another way, that he aged. So it's also equally possible that Círdan's age was due to a different type of torture. His desire to see the two trees of Valinor was denied. He never got to Aemon, and the trees were destroyed. So he's never going to get to look at them, and he has been feeling the sea longing for all of those years. He has wanted to return, well, not to return to Aemon, but to travel to Aemon, and he never got to go until deep into the Fourth Age. So that may have been psychologically very rough on Círdan, and that may have taken its toll in a physical sense. Now, as for how long fading actually takes, we don't know that. That's something that we can't know. It may have been accelerated in the Fourth Age. That's a possibility. Eventually the elves just weren't around anymore, at least not physically, after a time. So we don't really know how long it takes, and Círdan, being the oldest elf in Middle-earth, he may have already started to fade, and that may manifest itself as rapid aging, or rapid for an elf at least. Okay, next question. This one's from oh, I'm saying this right. Erkin Yilm? I hope I'm saying that right. Is Valinor in the Lord of the Rings universe actually North America? Was Tolkien inspired by America when he created Valinor? And did Frodo go to America in the last Lord of the Rings movie? No. The existence of the Americas is kind of vague and nebulous in Arda, and it's possible that at the time, in the Third Age, when Frodo sailed west, that there was no Americas. So, if you look at maps of the whole of Arda, drawn by Tolkien drew some very rough ones, but their fans have touched it up and done very good maps of Arda, and you'll see Middle-earth, and then to the west and to the south a little bit you'll see Numenor, and then to the west of that you have Aemon, which is the uttermost west, meaning that it was the furthest west that one could go before reaching the edge of the world. So after the Akalabeth, Numenor and Arda are removed. Numenor is destroyed, and I said Arda, Aemon. Numenor and Aemon are removed. Numenor is destroyed, and Aemon's no longer part of the world. It exists separately, and there's a thin ribbon of sea that connects Middle-earth, the continent of Middle-earth, with the continent of Arda. You can't just sail west and wind up there unless you know specifically how to do so, because the world was no longer flat after the Akalabeth. It was now round, so if you went west, you would eventually wind up in the east. They don't mention another continent being there, so without the straight road, you couldn't get to the west with a capital W, the West. You would wind up in the east. So the shape of the world was changed. Everything was different. If you look at this, they say there is no other continent there. You would just wind up on the east portion of Middle-earth. So where does that leave the Americas if Middle-earth is analogous to Europe and Africa and Asia? It's possible that it was only created with the second music after the final battle, Morgoth's return and all that, the Dagoroth, then the world is redone again, and that's where there would be another continent. There were two other continents with North America and South America. Aemon was not inspired by the Americas. Middle-earth vaguely represents, like I said, Europe, Africa, Asia. Numenor was inspired by the speculative continent of Atlantis. As a matter of fact, it was later, after its destruction, was called by the elves Atalan, which means downfallen. Atalante, actually, not Atalan. I said it wrong. Okay. Next question. This one was requested by two people. Maria and Dutch Patterson both wanted me to answer this one. I believe Maria wrote the question, but Dutch Patterson also tagged me in it. Do elves scar in the Tolkien universe? That's an interesting question. And I believe that, when I thought about it a little bit, there's no reason to believe that they don't. It's possible that due to the way that their bodies work and the way that their bodies heal, that they are likely less prone to scarring than men would be, but there's no reason to believe that they would not be scarred. Even the Ainur could have scars. So I'm going to read a section of the Silmarillion here regarding Morgoth and Thorondor. Thus died Fingolfin, high king of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of the elven kings of old. The orcs made no boast of that duel at the gate, neither do the elves sing of it, for their sorrow is too deep. Yet the tale of it is remembered still, for Thorondor, king of the eagles, brought the tidings to Gondolin, and to Hithlurn afar off. And Morgoth took the body of the elven king and broke it, and would have cast it to his wolves, but Thorondor came blasting from his eyrie among the peaks of the Chrysigrim, and he stooped upon Morgoth and marred his face. The rushing of the wings of Thorondor was like the noise of the winds of Manwë, And he seized the body in his mighty talons, and soaring suddenly above the darts of the orcs, he bore the king away. And he laid him upon a mountain top that looked from the north upon the hidden valley of Gondolin, and Turgon, coming, built a high cairn over his father. No orc dared ever after to pass over the mount of Fingolfin or draw nigh his tomb, until the doom of Gondolin was come and treachery was born among his kin. Morgoth went ever after, halt of 1 foot after that day, and the pain of his wounds could not be healed, and in his face was the scar that Thorondor made. So if Morgoth could be scarred, and be made to limp, and be made to feel permanent pain from a wound, I can't make any sort of assumption that elves don't scar. In the early versions of the story The Children of Húrin, as you could read in the Lays of Beleriand, Tolkien even made reference to Gwyndor being scarred. I mentioned a little bit earlier that Gwyndor was captured and tortured by Morgoth, and he aged from that. And in the early drafts, he specifically mentioned that Gwyndor was scarred. Now, despite the faster healing that elves have in comparison to men, even in the published Silmarillion, it doesn't mention Gwyndor being scarred, but it uses the word maimed was the word that was changed there. And it's mentioned that he still feels the pain of old wounds, which are sort of like scars on the inside, if you think about it. So the difference between elves and men isn't really physical, it's spiritual. And while the more powerful Fea that an elf has might heal their wounds faster, it isn't mentioned that it would prevent scarring. So I would say there's no reason to believe that elves don't scar. Okay, next question. This one's from Johanna Bigasova. I hope I said that right. Could Maglor be redeemed? Tolkien would tell you that anyone could be redeemed. Maglor, as any other child of Ilúvatar, could find forgiveness, but he'd have to make amends. For one, he'd have to sail west or abandon his body and be drawn to the west. Then he would have an extended stay in Mandos, and Mandos or Namo would hold him very long, though probably not as long as his father Feanor, and after this he would abide in Aemon. He would be forgiven. He would have found absolution. It's not in the nature of Tolkien to write about a character who can't be redeemed, but it has to be the character's choice to seek that redemption. Sauron had a choice, and out of fear and pride, he didn't take the opportunity to seek redemption. Even Melkor could have been redeemed, and he even seemed to be redeemed after the War of the Valar. He was pretending to be redeemed, at least. He was held for 3 ages in Mandos, but he chose to lapse back into evil. He showed his true self. So I doubt that, Mandos would hold any elf forever. Even Melkor was only held for 3 ages. Okay, next question. This is from Aido, who asks, by the time of the War of the Ring, did Saruman and Gandalf remember who they actually were as Ainur, where they had come from, and who Eru and the Valar were? I believe they had memories, but they were vague memories. Their memories were limited due to the mission that they were on. It was thought that they had to fully immerse themselves in Middle-earth. The Valar did not want memories of the Undying Lands complicating things. But there was a back door that was put in. They could never really forget everything. And if they completed their mission, they would be filled with the urge to return to Valinor, to sail west. So I don't believe that their memories faded over time. Their memories were limited, but I believe they were just as limited when they first arrived in Middle-earth as they would have been, late in the Third Age when the War of the Ring happened. And really, we don't know much about their early interactions with other people. We can't know. We don't know much about the wizards when they first arrived. We know when they arrived, we know how they arrived, and we know where they traveled and where they went, but we don't get interactions of them talking to people and explaining who they are and introducing themselves. Now, Círdan knew what they were. Círdan knew where they came from, and he shared that knowledge with a few very important elves, such as Elrond and Galadriel, but for the most part, the denizens of Middle-earth didn't know who or what the wizards were. Now, Gandalf makes a few oblique references to his past in The Lord of the Rings. He mentions that he was called Olorin in his youth, and he refers to Aemon as the West that is forgotten. And I believe his reference to Aemon as being forgotten isn't saying that he forgot about it, otherwise he wouldn't be bringing it up at all. Where did he come from then, if he doesn't know? He wouldn't say he came from the West that is forgotten. I believe what Tolkien is doing is he's having Gandalf be poetic and saying that the West, Aemon, is generally forgotten in Middle-earth. Not to say that Gandalf forgot that he's from there. He may not have many memories of his life in Aemon, but he knows he's from Aemon. And he certainly didn't forget Iluvatar or the Valar. He made reference to the Secret Fire when he faced off against the Balrog, for example. He probably just forgot his words, his deeds when he was in Aemon. Anything that didn't pertain to his mission. He knows he's a Maya. He knows he was sent to Middle-earth by the Valar, and he knows why. Everything else is not important, and that's probably what was shed. Okay, next question. This one is from... Oh, this one's anonymous. We don't have a lot of anonymous ones this time. Does Gollum's loincloth have a pocket, or does Gollum have other clothes with pockets? I'm talking about book Gollum, not movie Gollum. Well, what types of clothes that Gollum's wearing, they didn't go into a lot of detail about that in the book. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, it doesn't mention a loincloth, certainly. Much of Gollum's physical appearance is meant to be up to your imagination. He's described as being slimy, he's foul-smelling, he has very little hair, and what's there is very straggly. He is said to have black skin and very large, very pale eyes, and he has webbed feet. Early versions of Tolkien's work were a little bit more descriptive, if you read about the early Hobbit, but only slightly. It just said that he had clothing and that his clothing was dark-colored. So Gollum is definitely wearing clothes. He's not just wearing a loincloth like in the movie. It was mentioned in The Two Towers that he had a ragged garment. Now, I suppose this, you could say, maybe you could interpret that as being a loincloth, but somehow I doubt it. Gollum was known to wear clothes with pockets, and I'm going to give you a quote from The Hobbit here. Said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblin's teeth, wet shells, a bit of batwing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets. So Gollum is absolutely wearing clothes that have pockets, and I doubt that having to go out and leave the Misty Mountains, the caves beneath the Misty Mountains at least, and deal with the elements, like rain and the sun, which he hates, he's not going to be running around mostly naked. It just doesn't make sense. Whatever clothes he had, they were probably in pretty rough shape. But they did have clothes. He didn't wear a loincloth. Okay, next question. This one's from the Oski Bosky, who asks, can Eru make the 15th Valar stronger than himself? So, now, first of all, as I mentioned, there were actually 15 Valar. Usually people say 14, because either they forget about Tulkas because he arrived later, there were 14 that came down, and then there was Tulkas that came down later, or they're forgetting about Melkor because he was cast out of their councils. Now, getting that out of the way, the question is sort of a sneaky version of the old paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it? Which is meant to draw attention to the impracticality of the idea of a being without limits. Because if he's without limits, why can't he create a limit for himself? And if he can create a limit for himself, then is he truly limited? So, I'm certainly no theologian. And I've not pondered over long on the limits of, or the lack of limits of any divine beings. And in the case of this specific being, Eru Ilúvatar is of course fictional. As someone who has studied this particular fictional universe for decades, I can tell you that the concept of strength does not really apply to Ilúvatar. The method of creation is divine, and therefore it's vague. The blueprint, though, is music. And all of reality is a song, a theme. Now, you could think about it otherwise. Like, for example, you could say it's art, because music is art, after all. And you could ask the same question, could an artist create a depiction that is more real than the subject? And this is where the folly of the question is shown. How can a depiction become more real than reality? Much in the way that Iluvatar's creations and his children gave up parts of themselves to create what they created, so too must have Iluvatar, because that's just the way it works in Tolkien's universe. Now, we might say that his well of being is either unfathomably deep or perhaps doesn't have a bottom. Perhaps he's limitless in that sense. So, if his well of being is infinite, to create something greater than himself would be to create something that is more than infinite, which is a false concept right on its face. So, whether or not you would consider an impossibility to be a limit is a matter of philosophy, I guess, but a more apt question might be, can Iluvatar create something that is equal to himself? Is that possible? But even then, by definition, a creation cannot be infinite. Just as someone who you cannot write a song that doesn't repeat and yet has no end. And even if you did, you cannot write a song that has no beginning. And you could say Iluvatar could make music forever, and he is forever, but can he create something that has no beginning? Because if he created it, that signifies a beginning. So the answer is pretty much no. Even having created beings with no end, such as the Ainur, he has not created something truly infinite like himself, something without a beginning. So, like I said, strength is irrelevant. That doesn't come into play, because he could uncreate just as easily. If you consider an impossibility to be a limit or not, that's up to you. Okay, next question. And this one's anonymous, and this person asks, how was Beren able to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown? He was able to because Morgoth was actually sleeping. So the idea of Luthien enchanting Morgoth and his court to go to sleep was planted earlier in the Silmarillion in the same chapter. I'm going to read you that relevant part. It is told in the Lay of Luthien how she escaped from the house of Herlor. For she put forth her arts of enchantment and caused her hair to grow to great length. And of it she wove a dark robe that wrapped her beauty like a shadow, and it was laden with a spell of sleep. Of the strands that remained she twined a rope, and she let it down from her window. And as the end swayed above the guards that sat beneath the tree, they fell into a deep slumber. Then Luthien climbed from her prison, and shrouded in her shadowy cloak, she escaped from all eyes and vanished out of Doriath. So Luthien is, of course, not just any ordinary elf. And in the early writings, in the early versions of Beren and Luthien, she wasn't even an elf. She was a fairy. Beren was what was called a gnome, which was a tribe of elves that was later revised to be called the Noldor. So in reimagining the story as part of the Silmarillion, Beren was a man now, and Luthien's the elf, but she's a half-elf. Her father, Eleuthingol, was an elf, but her mother, Melian, was an Ainu spirit. She was a Maya. So Luthien has a wider breadth of magic and skills than your average elf would. And in that passage that I just read, we hear of Luthien using her powers to grow her hair very long, and she envelops it about her with a spell of sleep. And then she uses that to put guards to sleep, and she escapes. So Beren's first attempt at retrieving a Silmaril was disastrous. It didn't go well. It led to his capture, the death of Finrod, and because he sacrificed himself for Beren to escape. And the second time, he came with Luthien. Now, he didn't really like the idea of bringing Luthien with him. He cursed the oath that he had taken to Thingol because he hated the idea of bringing Luthien under the shadow of Morgoth. I'm going to read you the relevant passage of what Luthien actually did here to Morgoth that allowed Beren to take the Silmaril. Then Beren and Luthien went through the gate, and down the labyrinthine stairs, and together wrought the greatest deed that has been dared by elves or men. For they came to the seat of Morgoth in his nethermost hall, that was upheld by horror, lit by fire, and filled with weapons of death and torment. There Beren slunk in wolf's form beneath his throne, but Luthien was stripped of her disguise by the will of Morgoth, and he bent his gaze upon her. She was not daunted by his eyes, and she named her own name, and offered her service to sing before him, after the manner of a minstrel. Then Morgoth, looking upon her beauty, conceived in his thought an evil lust, and a design more dark than any that had yet come into his heart since he fled from Valinor. Thus he was beguiled by his own malice, for he watched her, leaving her free for a while, and taking secret pleasure in his thought. Then suddenly she eluded his sight, and out of the shadows began a song of such surpassing loveliness, and of such blinding power, that he listened perforce. And a blindness came upon him, and his eyes roamed to and fro, seeking her. All his court were cast down in slumber, and all the fires faded and were quenched, but the Silmarils in the crown on Morgoth's head blazed forth suddenly with a radiance of white flame, and the burden of that crown and of the jewels bowed down his head, as though the world were set upon it, laden with the weight of care, of fear, and of desire, and even the will of Morgoth could not support. Then Luthien, catching up her winged robes, sprang into the air, and her voice came dropping down like rain into pools, profound and dark. She cast her cloak before his eyes and set upon him a dream. Dark as the outer void where he once walked alone. Suddenly he fell, as a hill sliding an avalanche, and hurled like thunder from his throne, lay prone upon the floors of hell. The iron crown rolled echoingly from his head. All things were still. So Luthien uses her abilities to beguile Morgoth. She sings for him, and he's looking at her in lust, and she swayed, and his court fell asleep, and she was able to more directly attack Morgoth. She puts him to sleep, gives him dreams. He slumps down. The iron crown falls from his head. Beren is able to pry a Silmaril off the crown with his knife. Now, he actually did get the idea in his head, well, why not take all 3 Silmarils? Why not recover them all? But his knife, which was called Angrist, snapped when he went for the second one. So it wasn't simply that simple, though. It went badly after that. The werewolf Karkaroth, awoke and attacked him, and Beren thought that the Silmaril would repel the wolf, but he got his hand bitten off, and the wolf ate the Silmaril, and it took him a long time to track down that wolf and kill it, and it led to a lot of other things happening. Huan dies, the Girdle of Melian is compromised, a whole bunch of stuff happens, but that's that part of the story. So that's how he got the Silmaril. He had Luthien with him, and that was a big part of it. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. Could Radagast the Brown have used his magic to defeat Smaug the dragon or convince him to leave the Lonely Mountain because his power was effective on animals and nature? Tolkien never actually indicated that the magic of Radagast was specifically effective on animals or nature or dragons or anything like that. He was a lover of nature and he was a friend to animals, but his powers were the same as any other wizard. Nor would Radagast be able to befriend or convince Smaug of anything, due mostly to the fact that dragons aren't really part of nature, as it were. Dragons arose in the First Age, the first being Glaurung. He was a foul creation of Morgoth. The method of Glaurung's creation is vague, but when we look at the nature of Morgoth's powers, we can likely say that Glaurung was probably an existing creature, perverted by Morgoth's dark power. He may have just been a big lizard that Morgoth worked his magic on and made him larger, gave him intelligence. Though Glaurung was said to speak with Morgoth's voice, and his gaze was Morgoth's gaze, Glaurung did grow greater and more powerful over time. At one point, he escaped from Morgoth's fortress, and he started wreaking havoc. He was in an unfinished state at this point. He didn't have his armor, his scales, so he was hurt by the arrows that were shot at him, and he had to retreat back to Morgoth. Later, he was killed in a very crafty manner, an attack from below by Turin, who was able to stab Glaurung in the heart as he leapt over a river gorge. Smaug was related to the later winged dragons that emerged during the War of Wrath. Dragons are like orcs or trolls. They're not really part of nature. They're perversions of nature. They're made in mockery of nature. Radagast would not be able to convince Smaug to leave, and he would be wise enough not to attempt it. Okay. Next question, this one's from Dave Owens, and this is the one from the thumbnail. What do the elves do in the halls of Mandos? So this is a really good question. It's an excellent question. And, you might say, well, when somebody says that's a good question, it usually means I don't know. Well, let me elaborate a little bit here. Mandos is the domain of the Vala Namo. And Namo became so synonymous with his realm that most of the elves just call him Mandos. There was one brief mention in the Silmarillion that his name is actually Namo, but he's often called Mandos. But for the sake of not being too confusing when I'm talking about the realm and I'm talking about the Vala, I'm going to refer to him as Namo, and I'm going to refer to the place as Mandos. So, Mandos has several functions. For one, it's a place for elvish souls to gather upon the incident of bodily death, or fading, which is the elvish soul, the Fea, overwhelming the body, the Hroa. Elvish souls that come to Mandos are judged by Namo, who can then hold them for a time that he deems to be appropriate based on their deeds or their misdeeds, and then he will release them. If their bodily death occurred in the Undying Lands, they will go right back to their body, which will be unchanged because there's no decay in Aemon. If the body died in Middle-earth, then they have to wait for the body to completely decay and wither away to nothing, and then they get a new body that was identical to the one that they lost. The second function is that Mandos is a waypoint for the souls of men. The race of men, every man has an allotted time to spend in the world in Arda before perishing and passing beyond Ea into the void and whatever afterlife Iluvatar has put aside for mortals. Now, men who perish before their time still have to wait out their time, and that they don't go straight to the void, they have to wait in Mandos. Another function is it's a prison. As a matter of fact, you could even translate the word Mandos as prison if you stretch it just a little bit. No being, not even Manwe, not even Melkor, could leave the halls of Mandos without the permission of Namo, and that's how they were able to imprison Melkor for 3 ages. And lastly, the dwarves. We're going to talk about the dwarves very briefly. They believe that they went to Mandos upon their death to wait for an afterlife. They're not children of Iluvatar, they're creations of Aule. They go to Mandos and they stay there until the end of the world, and then there's the second music, and they will become children of Iluvatar and they will get an afterlife, and then they can pass from Arda, but they have to wait. So what is exactly done there? What does an elf do, or anyone do in Mandos? We don't really hear much about activities there. It's purgatorial, so to speak. The text implies that there are different sections to Mandos. For example, we know that Finwë and Miriel were there at the same time, but they weren't together in Mandos. But that Miriel was able to communicate with Finwë through her thought. She was there willingly. So it seems that her primary activity, at least, was resting. Now, for the most part, I think most elves, or men, or dwarves, as it were, their activity is mostly just waiting. Whether it's doing their time for misdeeds, or waiting to pass from the world, or waiting for the end of the world, as it were. There's no mention of the souls doing any sort of work, or doing anything for pleasure. They're not being physically punished, as it were. They're just waiting. And the key here is that the alternate name for Mandos is the Halls of Waiting, or the Halls of Awaiting. Mandos is described as being very large. It's a vast, cavernous place, and there's no real communication with the outer world except for the tapestries that are woven by Namo's wife, Vaire, and they depict the history of the world. So viewing the tapestries is probably the only thing the elves have to see what's going on outside there. Otherwise, they're just waiting. Really good question, though. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. How did Elrond get his name? What is the meaning of Elrond's name in Elvish? So Elrond and his brother Elros were kind of unique cases in terms of elves. We don't know what their given names actually were from their parents. We know that they were given their names by an adoptive father in a rather unusual circumstance. So Elrond and his brother Elros, they were the sons of Earendil and Elwing. Now, we don't know what their birth names were, and we don't know if their parents followed the elven custom of giving two names, where the father would give a name at the child's birth, and then the mother would give a different name sometime later. The reason that this is in question is because at the time that they were born, their parents, Earendil and Elwing, were mortals. They were not elves. Earendil's father, Tuor, was a man, and Elwing's father, Dior, was a man. So whatever their names were prior to being Elrond and Elros, we don't know, but they were at a very young age. They came afoul of the Sons of Feanor. And the Sons of Feanor attacked Cirion. This was the third kinslaying, the worst of them all. They were looking for the Silmarils. Now, they were foes by birth, but Maglor and Maethros, the Sons of Feanor, chose not to kill these young boys because they were not actively stopping them from pursuing the Silmarils. They weren't in their way, so to speak. So instead, they captured them and they kind of dumped them in a cave with a waterfall and just left. Now, Maglor later felt remorse about this. He went back, he rescued the boys, and he raised them as his sons. Maglor was the one who gave them the names Elrond and Elros. So the names sort of reflect the situation there. They were found in a cave with a waterfall. So Elros was named after the waterfall. Elros is derived from the Sindarin word El, which means star, and Ros, which means foam, as in the foam of a waterfall. So the poetic translation of Elros would be glittering star. Now, Elrond was named for the cave. So, because we know El is star, Rond is cavern or dome. So, Tolkien stated the more poetic translation of Elrond would be Vault of Stars. Okay, next question. This one's from the Oski Boski, who asks, is there a multiverse in the Tolkienverse? Well, not in the traditional sense, not in the modern sense that you may think. There's no multiverse or omniverse where there are other universes that are parallel to the main one, but there are stories that don't fit in the narrative canon or stories that diverge because there are multiple accounts of the way things went. You could take it as sort of a pseudo-multiverse. For example, the story told in the book Beren and Luthien is very different from the version of Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion. It's an alternate version. It was written much earlier. Luthien was a fairy. Beren was a gnomish elf, which Tolkien later called the Noldor, and the main villain was called Melko, not Melkor, and his chief servant was a cat named Tevildo. In an early version of The Fall of Gondolin, Tuor slew 5 Balrogs because the Balrogs were much more numerous and not as deadly and difficult to kill as they became in the later work. So there are also many conflicting origins for Galadriel and Celeborn. I'm going to get a little bit into this in one of the other answers. So, I mean, there's even a version of Galadriel and Celeborn's origin where they were both from Aemon and that they had the permission from the Valar to leave and go to Middle-earth. So you could choose to interpret these stories as alternate universe stories, or you can call them in-universe legends or stories that are told in a different way. That's the closest there is to being any kind of multiverse. And let me get to that one. I was going to save it for last, but I'm moving it over here. Let's talk about the Galadriel and Celeborn one, because I was asked this question anonymously. What is the difference between Galadriel and Celeborn? Were they different types of elves? So it's a tough one, really. Galadriel is a Noldo. She was born in Eldamar, which is in the Undying Lands. She saw the light of the two trees. She traveled to Middle-earth along the Helcaraxe with her uncle Fingolfin. Now, Celeborn was with her, or wasn't he? Did she meet him later? This is the issue. Tolkien wrote several conflicting origins of Galadriel and Celeborn's marriage. In the most likely origin, the one that's actually in the Silmarillion, Celeborn was a Cinda elf. He was born in Middle-earth, likely in Doriath, and he had never seen the light of the two trees. This was Tolkien's original plan, and that's what's in the Silmarillion. But later writings stated that Celeborn was a Teleran prince, and that he traveled to Middle-earth along with his wife Galadriel. And Tolkien even seemed unsure of whether or not they crossed the Helcaraxe, or did they use Teleran ships, not stolen ones like Feanor did, but because he was a Teleri elf in this version, he could have just used a ship. And did they have permission from the Valar? Some versions they do, and some versions they didn't. So, and even in the version where they had permission, it was likely to be rescinded because of what Morgoth had done, but they just went anyway. So Christopher Tolkien kept the early version, that Galadriel's from Aemon, Celeborn's likely from Doriath, he's a Cinda elf, because including the later writings where Celeborn is Teleri and he came from Aemon, it conflicted with a lot of other parts in the Silmarillion, and he would have had to rewrite a lot of it. It's sort of like the problem of the parentage of Gil-galad. Tolkien had Gil-galad as being, I believe it was Fingon's son, but that didn't make sense, because then why would he become the king after Turgon? He should have become the king before Turgon. So fixing these things sometimes was a little bit of a problem for Christopher Tolkien, because if he fixed it, that meant rewriting parts of his father's work, and he wasn't really comfortable doing that. So you could read about the various versions of Celeborn and Galadriel's past, and I just read a little bit of it to you earlier. Unfinished Tales. As a matter of fact, there's a whole section here. See if this is a fascinating book that I do recommend. I feel like a lot of people, they read The Hobbit, they read the Lord of the Rings, and then they read the Silmarillion sometimes, but very few people seem to read this one. But there's sort of 3 sections here. Well, really 4 sections. The first is all about the First Age. You have Tuorn coming to Gondolin, you have Children of Húrin. Then you have the Second Age, where it's mostly about Númenor, but there's the 4th section of the second part is the history of Galadriel and Celeborn and of Amroth, king of Lorien, and you get several different versions of the early Galadriel and Celeborn. And then part 3 is the Third Age. You get stuff about Isildur and Rohan and the Hobbit and stuff that's pertaining to the Lord of the Rings. And the 4th part is just some notes on Druadan and Istari and the Palantiri. So it's actually a really fascinating book, and I feel like that sometimes when I'll speak about things in chorus, they'll be like, I don't remember that from the Silmarillion. Where are you getting that from? I said, well, it's in Unfinished Tales. So there's a lot of things that weren't in the Silmarillion that are either in Unfinished Tales, or they're in the nature of Middle-earth, or the history of Middle-earth sometimes. But anyway, next question. This one's anonymous. How did Bilbo Baggins pay for his room and board at Rivendell? If there was, in fact, any sort of rent to pay, Bilbo was a hobbit of means. Now, I know, he left his fortune to Frodo, but he still had money on him. Because at the end of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo gave Sam a bag of gold. And he stated that he figured that Sam was going to get married soon, which turned out to be correct, and that he considered it to be a wedding present. So he called it, the words that he used was almost the last drop of Smaug vintage. Now the key word there is almost, meaning that even with this bag of gold that he's giving to Sam, that's not the last of his money. So he would still be able to pay expenses for a while, at least until he sailed west. Now, I have to be honest though, I don't think there was rent. I don't think that Bilbo was asked to pay for room and board at Rivendell. If you remember, at his birthday party, he didn't set out specifically for Rivendell. He set out to wander. He wanted to have more adventures. 17 years later, we learn that he has at some point settled in Rivendell, and he is essentially at this point retired from adventuring. I feel it's likely that he stopped there because he enjoyed Rivendell and he was asked to stay. Bilbo loved the elves. They loved him. They named him Elfriend. Even in his youth, he would trek off in the direction of Lindon, hoping to find elves that were traveling towards Lindon, or toward, whether they were going to the Grey Havens or they were just going there, celebrating the Elvish New Year. You could read a little bit about that in Unfinished Tales and the Quest of Erebor. Bilbo was also working on a really important task in Rivendell. He was translating ancient Elvish lore into Westron, into a readable form, and a collection of stories that we would call the Silmarillion. So the elves absolutely wanted him there. They saw value in him being there, and I don't think they would have been taking his gold, because what are they going to use it for, really? Okay, last question. In Chapter 8 of The Hobbit, why can the spiders see Bilbo's sword when he's invisible? This was an anonymous question, by the way. So the rules of how the One Ring works were kind of fuzzy in The Hobbit. In this case, he wrote that pulling out the sword, and the spiders were able to see it. Now, this seems weird, right? Well, why would they see the sword? It doesn't say Bilbo picked up the sword off the ground while he was invisible. Then you would understand they would see the sword move. It says that he drew out the sword. So, what does that mean? Let me read the relevant passage from The Hobbit. With that he turned and found the last space between the two tall trees had been closed with a web, but luckily not a proper web, only great strands of double-thick spider rope run hastily backwards and forwards from trunk to trunk. Out came his little sword. He slashed the threads to pieces and went off singing. The spiders saw the sword, though I don't suppose they knew what it was, and at once the whole lot of them came hurrying after the hobbit along the ground and the branches, hairy legs waving, nippers and spinners snapping, eyes popping full of froth and rage. They followed him into the forest until Bilbo had gone as far as he dared. Then, quieter than a mouse, he stole back. So, the rules of how Bilbo's magic ring works at this point, they're kind of in flux. In The Hobbit, it isn't really said that it turns him wholly invisible. If he's in very, very bright light, you can see him as like a pale shadow, and that's something that was not mentioned again. It was mentioned in The Hobbit, but it wasn't mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. Why would his sword be visible when he pulls it out? Was it visible in the sheath? Is the sheath invisible? Why are his clothes invisible then? So there's an easy answer to all this. There's an easy way to make this all go away. Bilbo's the one telling the story, and he's telling it from memory, and he's not the most reliable narrator out there. In the story, I'm referencing this again from Unfinished Tales, in the story The Quest of Erebor, Gandalf mentions that Bilbo's story is off in several ways, and not just in his manner of finding the One Ring, but the entire meeting between Bilbo and Thorin was different than the way that Gandalf remembered it. According to Gandalf, Thorin was wrathful in that he hated Bilbo at first sight. And the reasons that Bilbo may not have put that in his book are either because he didn't want to, or perhaps he didn't even pick up on the dwarf's contempt. Maybe he was oblivious to it. We can reason that the spiders probably did not actually see Sting, but they saw the results of his work. That's the way Bilbo wrote it. The most likely thing is that Bilbo's cutting their webs, and they're seeing that something is cutting the webs, and so they're going for that, and they're chasing him. So that's probably what happened. Anyway, guys, it's been real. I've enjoyed this, but we're going to stop right here. Send me some questions, and if you haven't already, if you've made it all the way to the end of this video and you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and all that nonsense, and I'll see you guys next week.